There is no storm quite like the one inside a sinking ship, no silence quite like the stretch of empty ocean when rescue seems impossible, and no miracle quite like the story you're about to hear. In November of 1942, a quiet passenger liner, the SS City of Cairo, set sail across the South Atlantic carrying civilians, soldiers and families simply trying to escape the worst of the war. They never reached their destination. Torpedoed by a German U-boat thousands of miles from help, the survivors were cast into lifeboats with almost no food, no water, and no reason to believe they would ever be seen again. What followed was one of the most extraordinary, heartbreaking, and statistically impossible survival sagas in oceanic history. Sharks, storms, starvation, a whale that nearly destroyed them, and a rescue that should never have happened. This is the forgotten ordeal of the SS City of Cairo. The story the world overlooked, the miracle the survivors carried in silence, and the nightmare that refused to let them go. The SS City of Cairo should never have been at sea that November, not because she was unseaworthy, though the old steamship had long passed her prime, but because the world around her was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. She was a lumbering vessel, built in 1915, with faded red funnels, weather-beaten decks, and engines that rattled like an old man's cough when pushed too hard. The ship had served through World War I, transported families between continents, carried mail, cargo, livestock, even the occasional travelling orchestra. She had lived long enough to become ordinary, until 1942 turned every ocean into a battlefield. On November 1st, 1942, the city of Cairo lay moored in Cape Town, preparing for what would unknowingly be her final journey. She carried 296 people, 151 crew, 101 passengers, a handful of military personnel, women and children fleeing the war in Asia and Africa, and below decks, tightly secured in wooden crates and metal boxes, lay her deadliest cargo, £700,000 in silver rupees, destined for India's wartime economy. The passengers never knew. Many were families relocating after losing homes in the Middle East or Burma. Others were civil servants returning to England on leave, or retirees escaping the turmoil in North Africa. No one imagined that this journey, a long, slow trek from Cape Town to Brazil, then across the Atlantic to Britain, would place them directly in the crosshairs of a waiting hunter. U-68, commanded by Carl Friedrich Merton, one of Germany's most calculating and experienced submarine captains. The passengers boarded under a gentle Cape Town sun, unaware of their invisible shadow beneath the waves thousands of miles ahead. Among the passengers was a woman named Elizabeth Harrington, a widow in her mid-30s, travelling with her two children, Alice, age 9, and Peter, age 11. Elizabeth's husband had been a railway engineer in Sudan before illness took him. With the war tightening around the Mediterranean, she decided to take her children home to England, hoping to rebuild a life with her sister in Devon. She stood on the deck with a hat pinned carefully in place, holding Alice's hand and gently urging Peter to stay close. The boy kept leaning over the rail, fascinated by the harbour's bustle, cranes clanking, men shouting, crates swinging in the air. He didn't see danger anywhere. Children rarely do. First Officer Willis Spencer, a seasoned seaman with 20 years on the oceans, moved along the deck performing his final checks. He trusted the ship, even in her age. She wasn't fast, but she was sturdy, and more importantly, he trusted his crew. He exchanged nods with the chief engineer, inspected lifeboat ropes, and watched the boarding with a silent, practiced eye. Spencer didn't smile much, but he had a reputation for calm leadership. That trait would become the thin thread holding many people's lives together. At 5 p.m, the lines were cast off. The whistle sounded long, deep and weary, like the ship herself knew she was heading into fate. Passengers crowded the rails as Cape Town faded into a watercolour backdrop. Children waved at people they had never met. Women held their hats against the sea breeze. Older men lit pipes and spoke quietly about British progress in North Africa. The war seemed far away. The city of Cairo moved into open water with a slow, rhythmic thumping of pistons, leaving behind the African continent for the vastness of the South Atlantic. No escort, no protection, no convoy, just an old ship her passengers, and a silent ocean that held both promise and death. For the first week, life aboard was almost peaceful. Meals were taken at long, communal tables, children played games on the deck, passengers gathered around the radio for war updates, though reception was often weak. Nights were spent under dimmed lights, a wartime precaution, with blackout curtains drawn across portholes. Elizabeth read Dickens to her children in the evenings. Spencer walked the decks in silence, always alert. The captain, William Rogerson, maintained strict zigzag courses to avoid submarines, though the old ship's sluggishness made evasive manoeuvres nearly symbolic. Unknown to them, far across the ocean, German intelligence had noted the ship's projected route. U-68 patrolled those waters, and its commander, Merton, had already sunk dozens of ships. The city of Cairo was sailing toward him like fate itself. By mid-November, the South Atlantic turned choppy. Steel plates groaned as swells lifted the ship's bow. Rain streaked across the deck, making the wooden planks slippery underfoot. The passengers adapted easily enough. Seasickness bothered some, but most accepted the discomfort as part of sea travel. What they didn't know was that the old ship had slowed even more. Her engines were tired, she struggled against the waves, and she had become an irresistible target for any submarine commander hunting merchant vessels. Below the surface, moving silently at 9 knots, the U-boat was closing in. On the evening of November 6th, First Officer Spencer noticed something that unsettled him, a smudge on the horizon, like exhaust haze or a distant silhouette. He reported it to Captain Rogerson, who studied the faint shape through binoculars. It vanished into the grey. Submarines didn't usually surface in daylight after attacking, but they might shadow a ship waiting for darkness. Rogerson ordered an even sharper zigzag pattern. Passengers felt nothing unusual. They ate, talked, laughed and rocked gently with the motion of the ship. But for the first time, Spencer felt a tightening in his chest, a sailor's instinct whispering trouble. He walked the deck late into the night, listening to the sea. The ship creaked, wind hissed through the rigging, and somewhere out there, something was watching. The city of Cairo steamed on into the dark. The night of November 6th, 1942, arrived quietly, the kind of calm that hides danger beneath its smooth surface. The city of Cairo moved at her usual slow pace, engines thumping rhythmically, pushing the old hull through the black South Atlantic. Dinner had ended hours earlier. Most passengers had gone to bed, lulled by the rocking of the ship. A few lingered on deck under the blackout screens, whispering quietly, eyes adjusting to the moonless sky. The ship's lamps were shielded to avoid drawing attention. Only the faintest orange glow seeped through the cracks around the saloon's doors. First Officer Spencer walked his usual night round, his boots tapping softly across the damp wooden deck. He scanned the water every few steps. The horizon was empty. The air smelled of salt, oil and distant rain. Nothing unusual. But far below, invisible to everyone above, U-68 glided silently, just beneath the surface, her captain watching through the periscope. Carl Friedrich Merton had shadowed the city of Cairo all day. He'd studied her slow zigzags, assessed her speed, and waited until he was satisfied the target was unescorted. Now, positioned perfectly off her starboard side, he prepared to fire. Elizabeth Harrington was preparing her children's beds when she heard a distant, muffled thud. It was so soft she thought it might be part of the engines. Alice didn't notice. Peter froze, listening. "Mum, what was that?" Before she could answer, the world exploded. A violent crack ripped through the centre of the ship, a tearing metallic roar followed by a blast so powerful it flung open doors and shattered glass in dozens of cabins. The floor lurched upward, then dropped. Alice screamed. Peter fell. Elizabeth grabbed her children as luggage crashed from racks and water pipes burst overhead. Lights flickered, sputtered, then died. The ship groaned like an injured animal. Below decks, where many crew slept, the torpedo impact sounded like a giant hammer smashing the hull. Men were thrown from bunks. Steam hissed through ruptured valves. Somewhere deep in the engine room, alarms began to wail. Passengers spilled into the passageways, disoriented, barefoot, clutching coats or children. Someone yelled that the ship had been hit. Another shouted for calm. A woman sobbed uncontrollably as water surged beneath her door. Captain Rogerson appeared from the bridge, instantly taking command. "Lifeboats ready! All passengers, To muster stations! His voice cut through the chaos. Officers relayed orders. Crew ran to their posts, but the ship was already listing noticeably to starboard. Spencer reached the deck in under a minute. The sight froze him. A plume of water and debris shot upward from the starboard forward hold, the place where the silver rupees were stored. The torpedo had struck a fatal part of the ship's belly. Smoke rolled across the deck, illuminated faintly by the stars above. A ragged hole gaped in the hull, pouring water into compartments that were never designed to handle flooding. He sprinted toward the bridge. "Captain, she's taking water fast." Rogerson nodded grimly. "We abandoned ship." No hesitation, no doubt. He knew the city of Cairo could not survive. Elizabeth emerged onto the deck with Alice clinging to her waist and Peter gripping her hand so tightly her fingers went numb. Crewmen were lowering lifeboats, shouting instructions in the dim light. The angle of the deck kept shifting, subtle at first, then more severe with every passing second. "Life jackets, quickly!" a steward yelled, tearing open storage lockers. Elizabeth slipped jackets onto her children, her hands trembling. Peter tried to act brave, but his voice shook when he asked, "Mum, are we sinking?" She forced herself to stay calm. "We're getting off the ship. Stay with me." A crewman approached. "Ma'am, follow me. Lifeboat number 6. But just then, a sickening metallic groan echoed through the hull. The ship shuddered violently. A second torpedo struck. The blast tore through the engine room. Steam erupted in a blinding cloud. A fireball shot upward, lighting the sky for a split second and illuminating dozens of terrified faces. Several passengers were knocked off their feet. A sailor was thrown over the rail into the water. Parts of the deck buckled. The ship listed even farther to starboard. The lights died fully. The deck became a silhouette of frantic shadows. The crew struggled desperately to lower the boats. Some davits jammed, ropes tangled. One lifeboat plunged too quickly, smashing into the side of the ship and nearly capsizing in the water. Spencer took command of Boat 4. His face was streaked with soot, but his voice remained steady. "Women and children over the rail, carefully." Elizabeth hesitated, torn between fear and urgency. Peter was pushed forward by another passenger, and Alice clung to her mother, crying. A crewman lifted Alice into the lifeboat. Peter followed. "Ma'am, go now," Spencer barked. Elizabeth climbed over the rail. The deck tilted so sharply she nearly lost her grip and dropped into the boat. Moments later, Boat 4 hit the water. Captain Rogerson remained on the bridge, refusing to leave until the last possible moment. The radio operator, James Croxton, tapped out a distress signal manually, his hands shaking. "SOS, City of Cairo torpedoed. 29 degrees, 50 minutes south, 06 degrees, 0 minutes west, requiring immediate assistance." He repeated it over and over, long after water reached his ankles. On the deck below, several passengers were still trying to climb into the remaining boats, but the tilt grew worse. The bow dipped. Waves washed across the forecastle. Spencer shouted from the water, "Abandon ship! Get clear!" The lifeboats paddled away as fast as they could. Elizabeth clutched her children, unable to take her eyes off the dying ship. The city of Cairo groaned deeply, a sound that carried across the black ocean like the final breath of a living creature. Then the stern lifted, the bow plunged, and the old vessel slid beneath the water. A single hiss of escaping steam marked her end. Debris bobbed to the surface. A few men thrown overboard shouted weakly for help. The lifeboats drifted, scattered in the darkness. The ocean swallowed the last trace of the ship, and silence fell. An eerie, suffocating silence broken only by the slap of waves against the small wooden boats. When dawn approached, the lifeboats were spread hopelessly far apart. No rescue ship was in sight. The radio signal had been too brief to confirm. Of the 296 people who had been on board, many were now missing or dead. Those who survived stared at the endless horizon, realizing they were alone at sea, with limited supplies, no certainty of rescue, and thousands of miles of open water in every direction. The struggle for survival had only begun. Dawn on the South Atlantic came slowly, a pale, indifferent light spreading across a horizon that offered no rescue, no land, not even the shadow of a distant ship. Only empty water stretching in every direction. The lifeboats bobbed like specks on the surface, half scattered, half drifting. The closest were barely within sight of each other. The farthest might as well have been alone in another ocean. Elizabeth Harrington woke to the sound of her children shivering beside her. The cold night had wormed its way into their bones. Her dress was still damp from spray. Peter's lips were pale. Alice's teeth chattered uncontrollably. The sun began to rise, weak but golden, a deceptive promise of warmth. First Officer Spencer stood in Lifeboat 4, his voice ragged from shouting during the night. "We count 47 in this boat," he announced, "and 4 others are somewhere to the east. We'll signal them when the sun is higher." He looked around at the huddled passengers. There were too many people, too few supplies. The boat rode low in the water. Every swell threatened to spill over the sides. At the stern, a sailor checked the emergency locker. His expression darkened. "Water rations! For maybe 10 days at most," he said. "Biscuits for less." A murmur of dread rippled through the survivors. They had expected rescue to come within hours. Now, hearing this, the reality sank in. They might be here for weeks. By mid-morning, the sun was already harsh, burning through layers of exhausted nerves. The calmness of the first hours felt mocking, the ocean too peaceful for what it offered underneath. A lookout in Boat 4 stood on the thwart, shielding his eyes. "I see one boat, maybe 2, he said. "Far off." But no ships, no smoke, no sound of engines, just the creak of oars and the occasional cry from an infant in Boat 5. Spencer blew his whistle and raised a small signal flag, the only way to communicate between boats. Slowly, painstakingly, they tried to group together, but the ocean had its own plans, its currents drifting the lifeboats apart almost as quickly as they approached. That afternoon, Spencer gathered everyone's attention. "We begin immediate rationing," he announced. "Half a biscuit each, a tablespoon of water, no exceptions." A few people protested. One man demanded more for his wife, who was ill. Another argued that help would come soon, that rationing was unnecessary. Spencer shut it down with a single, unyielding sentence. "Rescue is not coming today." The silence afterward was heavier than the heat. Elizabeth broke a biscuit into 3 pieces, 2 for the children, 1 for herself. She watched others do the same. Some men turned their backs to hide the fact that they were giving their portions to the younger passengers. A woman quietly passed her share to an elderly stranger beside her. Suffering united them, even in those first hours. The second day was worse. The wind died completely. The sun turned vicious, reflecting off the water like a silver-hot mirror. Every breath tasted of salt. Lips cracked, skin blistered. The survivors who had jumped from the sinking ship were in worse shape than the others, their clothes stiff with dried seawater, their bodies dehydrating faster. Some began to hallucinate. A man in Boat 2 reached over the side, insisting he saw a freshwater stream just below the surface. Another swore he saw an island on the horizon and tried to row toward it until the others restrained him. Elizabeth kept her children under a blanket, using her own jacket to shade their faces. She whispered stories to distract them about England, about home, about anything except the ocean rising and falling around them like a living wall. Alice sobbed quietly when she thought her mother wasn't watching. On the second night, the sea became unnervingly still. No breeze, no waves, just the boats gently drifting, but the calm brought new dangers. Oil from the sinking still floated on the surface, a thin slick that gave off a faint chemical smell. Whenever the boats brushed through it, the survivors felt their skin sting. Sharks began to appear, slow shadows circling beneath the boats. Sometimes a fin rose briefly before slicing back into the black water. A woman screamed when one bumped the hull. It wouldn't be the last time. Just before midnight, a bright flash lit the sky. A meteor, long and trailing, brilliant against the stars. Dozens of survivors gasped. For a moment, hope surged. "Signal flare," someone shouted. But the sky remained dark. The ocean remained endless. The meteor was just a meteor. A false miracle. Spencer exhaled sharply. "We keep watch," he said. "We survive until rescue comes." But there was no telling when that would be. 24 hours, a week, longer. On the third morning, a man in Boat 6 stopped responding. He simply stared at the horizon, unmoving. Sunstroke had burned his mind. By noon, he died quietly in the bow, his head resting against the gunwale. The boat crew performed a brief, solemn prayer. Then they slid him into the water. The sharks were waiting. The ocean swallowed him without a ripple. Elizabeth held her children closer. They were witnessing things no child should see, no adult either. That evening, Spencer addressed everyone again, his voice steady but strained. "We keep discipline. We keep our strength. If we drift east, we may reach shipping lanes." Someone asked how far. He hesitated. Thousands of miles. A cold wave of dread washed over the survivors, deeper than the ocean beneath them. At the end of the third day, the horizon darkened. Rolling thunderheads formed, tall, bruised, magnificent. The survivors watched them gather like a looming wall. The ocean, which had been eerily calm, began to stir. Small waves slapped the sides of the lifeboats. Wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and danger. The boats creaked, children cried. The first drops began to fall. Spencer looked at the sky and whispered to no one in particular, "God help us, we're not ready for this." The storm was coming, and the real ordeal, the one that would push every person on those boats to the edge of their strength, was about to begin. The first gust struck just after sunset, a hard, sudden slap that rippled across the water and sent a shiver through every lifeboat. Then came another, stronger, carrying salt spray that stung the skin and blurred vision. By then, the sky was nearly black. A monstrous wall of clouds rolled over the horizon like a living thing, swallowing the last traces of daylight. Spencer stood in boat 4, gripping the gunwale. "The storm's early," he muttered, "and it's coming fast." A moment later, thunder cracked open the sky. The quiet ocean that had tormented the survivors with heat now turned vicious without warning. Waves rose sharply, slamming against the hulls with bone-jarring force. The lifeboats pitched violently. People clung to ropes, benches, each other. A woman was thrown sideways, striking her shoulder against the metal edge. A child wailed. 2 oars snapped as sailors fought to keep the boats facing the waves. "Keep a bow into the wind," Spencer shouted. "Row, row, or we'll capsize." But the sea had no interest in obedience. The wind roared in from the southwest, howling over the open boats like an animal. Rain followed, fierce, cold, hammering down in sheets so thick it turned the world into a blur of grey water and indistinct shapes. In the chaos, the boats drifted apart. At first, survivors tried to shout to each other across the growing distance. "Boat 2, hold steady! Signal us when the wave breaks! Where's 5? Where's 6? But their voices were swallowed by the storm. Rain slashed into eyes. Wind ripped words away as soon as they were spoken. One by one, the lifeboats vanished from sight, swallowed by walls of water. Elizabeth Harrington felt panic seize her chest as she lost sight of the nearest boat. Through the rain, she made out the faint outline of boat 3, then nothing. Peter clung to her arm. Alice cried out as a wave crashed over them, drenching everyone. Their thin blanket flew overboard. "Hold each other," Elizabeth yelled, wrapping them both in her arms as the lifeboat bucked beneath them. For the first time, she wondered if they would all be thrown into the sea. Lightning forked across the sky, jagged white lines illuminating the lifeboats for a split second at a time. In each flash, Spencer could see the terrified faces in his boat, the swirling grey ocean, and nothing else. Every boat was alone now. Another wave smashed into the side. The lifeboat tilted dangerously. A man was pitched forward and nearly thrown overboard. 2 sailors grabbed him, pulling him back just as the boat righted. More lightning, more darkness, more screaming. The storm bent time. Every second stretched into minutes, every minute into an hour. The survivors lost any sense of where they were or how long it had been. Spencer finally shouted over the wind, "Bail the water! Keep her afloat!" Men and women used cups, hands, even shoes to scoop out seawater. The rain undid their work almost instantly, but they kept going because stopping meant drowning. A massive wave hit boat 4 broadside. Elizabeth felt the world tilt. Cold water flooded in. Someone screamed, a raw, desperate sound. A sailor at the stern lost his grip and fell backward. He hit the gunwale and flipped overboard. Elizabeth heard the splash more than she saw it. "Man overboard!" someone shouted, but no one could jump in. The lifeboat was moments from capsizing itself. A rope was hurled, disappearing into the darkness. "Grab it!" Spencer shouted into the storm. "Grab it!" But only the wind answered. Lightning flashed once more, illuminating the empty water. The sailor was gone. The boat fell silent except for sobbing and the relentless drum of rain. Around midnight, the storm reached its peak. Waves towered like cliffs, crashing onto the lifeboats with such force that wood groaned and nails loosened. Oars were ripped from hands, a mast splintered. Boat 2's rudder snapped completely. In the shrieking chaos, Elizabeth saw something that chilled her more than the storm. The shape of another lifeboat turning sideways. "They're broadside!" someone screamed. "They'll roll!" and roar they did. Boat 6 capsized under a massive wave. It flipped cleanly, a dark silhouette briefly visible in a lightning flash, and then vanished upside down into the furious sea. Elizabeth pressed her children to her chest to cover their eyes, but she couldn't cover their ears. The screams were unmistakable. They cut through the night like knives. The storm drowned them moments later. As the wind pushed rain in sideways sheets, Spencer felt the hull of their own lifeboat shudder. A long, low, cracking sound rose from beneath the benches. The survivors froze. Another wave hit, and this time the crack widened. "We've sprung a plank!" a sailor shouted. "Starboard side! She's taking water!" Elizabeth felt the cold creep up over her ankles. The boat was filling faster. Spencer forced calm into his voice. "Plug it with anything you can. Clothes, blankets." "We don't have blankets," someone cried. "Everything's soaked." A crewman stripped off his shirt and jammed it into the widening seam. Another used his own jacket. Someone else tore fabric from a skirt. It slowed the leak barely, but the boat held for now. In the final stretch of the storm, exhaustion beat even fear. People slumped over the thwarts, drained of strength. Mothers huddled over children. Sailors rowed until their hands bled. Every few minutes, someone whispered, "Is it easing? Is it ending? Please, let it be over." And then, at last, the wind began to relent. The waves slowly shrank from walls to hills, then to rolling swells. The rain weakened to a steady patter. Thunder drifted farther away. By dawn, the storm was gone. The sunrise revealed a scene of heartbreak. Only 3 lifeboats were visible in the vast expanse of ocean. 2 were half swamped. One had lost its mast completely, and several boats, including the one that capsized, were nowhere to be seen. Some survivors clutched the thwarts in hollow silence. Others sobbed openly. 2 prayed softly under their breath. Elizabeth kissed her children's foreheads, tears mixing with the salt on her cheeks. They were alive against all odds, but the ocean had taken others. Spencer surveyed the horizon, jaw tight, eyes bloodshot. "We regroup," he said quietly. "We repair what we can." Then, after a long pause, he added, "And we carry on." The storm was over, but the true ordeal, hunger, exposure, drifting thousands of miles, had only just begun. The morning after the storm was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, a vast, heavy silence broken only by the creak of wood and the sighing of tired waves. A warm sun rose over the scarred survivors, and for a few minutes the light felt comforting, but comfort faded quickly. When the survivors looked into the supply boxes, their hearts sank. The storm had destroyed almost a third of their remaining water. One ration barrel had cracked and leaked seawater inside it, making most of its contents unusable. Several tins of biscuits were reduced to wet mush, mixed with sand, salt and splinters. Spencer crouched beside the supplies, running the calculations silently. His face tightened. A woman asked, "How bad is it?" He answered bluntly, "We have enough water for 6 days, at half rations." "6 days," murmured another. "We could drift for weeks." Spencer didn't challenge the remark. He only tightened his jaw. There was no point in sugarcoating anything now. By noon, the sun rose high and hot. The survivors realised quickly that starvation didn't begin with pain. It began with a kind of strange pressure, an emptiness that felt both sharp and dull. A hollowing, children whimpered. Adults endured in silence. Spencer, in the duty of command, cut their rations even further by evening. Half a biscuit, a swallow of water, 3 drops for a child. People obeyed because the alternative was dying even sooner. Elizabeth gave her ration to Peter and Alice without hesitation, pretending she had eaten earlier. By nightfall, she felt lightheaded whenever she stood. One of the sailors, Earnshaw, attempted to calculate their position, using nothing but memory and the position of the rising sun. The sextants and compasses had been lost in the storm. Now all they had were 2 oars, a broken rudder, and determination. "We're drifting west," he said finally. "Currents will take us toward the Brazilians eventually." "How long?" someone asked. "Impossible to say," which was the same as saying too long. The first night of calm was a cruel joke. The sky was cloudless, revealing a razor-sharp canopy of stars. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it became a reminder of how utterly small they were, little specks on an endless ocean floating farther and farther away from anyone who might save them. Some survivors woke, screaming from nightmares. Others whispered to themselves, unable to calm racing thoughts. One older woman insisted she could hear the city of Cairo still sinking somewhere beneath them, groaning like a ghost. Spencer assured her it was only the sea. He wasn't entirely sure. Hunger was tolerable, thirst was not. By day 2 after the storm, salt sores formed on their lips, tongues swelled, every breath tasted like brine. Worse, the sun baked them relentlessly. The boats were reflecting ovens, wood radiating heat, salt crusting on skin, every inch of shade guarded like treasure. A man in boat 5 broke. He slumped forward, eyes glazed, and dipped his hands into the ocean, lifting water to his mouth. "Stop him!" someone shouted. 4 hands yanked him back, but he had already swallowed. Within an hour, he was delirious. His tongue cracked. He begged for more. "Just one sip," he moaned. "Just one sip, please." They tied his wrists gently, tears in their eyes. "Please forgive me," Spencer whispered to him. "We're trying to save you." The sailor who had drunk seawater died just before dawn. There was no violent collapse, just a slow slipping away, his breath weakening, his body exhausted from dehydration and the build-up of salt in his system. His final words were barely audible. "I'm thirsty." When he stopped breathing, a heavy silence fell. The group stared at his still form, unsure what to do. Elizabeth bowed her head. "We can't keep him aboard," she said softly. Spencer nodded. They wrapped the man in a spare tarpaulin, tied it with rope and lowered him over the side. He slipped quietly into the sea. A few bubbles rose, then nothing. Alice cried. Peter held her hand. Death had become part of the boat now. By the 4th day, the psychological strain became unbearable. People hallucinated. Some whispered to invisible friends or relatives. Others insisted they could see land on the horizon, a green shimmer that vanished whenever anyone else looked. A man in boat 3 began laughing uncontrollably, pointing at clouds and claiming they were angels beckoning him home. Another tried to stand, saying he needed to go for a stroll. 3 people tackled him before he stepped overboard. The children suffered worst. They grew silent, too weak to cry. Elizabeth felt her own grip on reality slipping during the hottest part of the afternoon. The world wobbled. Her vision narrowed. She tasted blood on her cracked lips. Spencer noticed and gently forced his own ration into her hand. "You need this more than I do," he told her quietly. Elizabeth shook her head, but he insisted. She ate it slowly, tears stinging her eyes, not from gratitude, but from the humiliation of needing someone else's help. On the 5th day, a cry went up. "Ship! Ship to the east!" Everyone lifted their heads, hearts thudding. Squinting into the glare, they saw a dark shape on the horizon, tall, solid, unmoving. "Light the flares!" Spencer barked. They had 3 left. The first lit with difficulty, its red spark hissing against the wind. The survivors waved it frantically, shouting hoarsely, voices cracking with hope. No response. They fired the second flare. Still nothing. They waited an hour, watching the shape. But the truth slowly revealed itself. It wasn't a ship. It was a cloud bank, a dark mass mimicking the line of a hull. The disappointment struck harder than hunger. It crushed them. People sobbed openly. Others stared blankly. Elizabeth whispered to her children, "We will keep trying. We must." But even she felt hope thinning like mist. By day 6, the toll of starvation was undeniable. Bodies thinned, cheeks hollowed, skin shrank tight over ribs. The oldest survivors deteriorated fastest. A retired schoolteacher slipped into unconsciousness. A cabin steward grew too weak to sit and lay curled in the bottom of the boat. A teenage boy passed out mid-sentence while talking about his dog back home. They laid him down gently, not knowing whether he would wake. Peter asked Elizabeth, "Mama, are we going to die?" Elizabeth forced strength into her voice she did not have. "No, darling, not today." "But what about tomorrow?" "We will face tomorrow when it comes." On the 7th morning after the storm, Earnshaw lifted his head and whispered, "The currents shifted." "What does that mean?" Elizabeth asked. "It means we're drifting northwest, toward the shipping lanes." A stir of hope rippled through the boat, tiny, tentative, easily broken, but hope nonetheless. Spencer looked at the survivors, his voice hoarse but firm. "We hold steady, we keep rationing, and we watch the horizon." Their ordeal was far from over, but the ocean, for the first time in days, seemed to be moving with them rather than against. That night, the survivors lay huddled together, too weak for conversation, too tired for fear, listening to the waves slap gently against the hull. The stars above looked impossibly distant, yet somewhere out there, a ship existed, a ship that might cross their drifting path, if they could survive long enough to meet it. The 8th morning on the open ocean began with a sickly grey dawn and an eerie calm, too calm. The kind of stillness that makes every survivor in a lifeboat uneasy. The sea often gives warnings in silence before it gives them in sound. Spencer felt it first, a tremor, a dull push beneath the hull, like something passing directly underneath. "Hold on," he whispered. The survivors clutched the wooden sides, hearts pounding, eyes widening. Then the water erupted. At first, the survivors thought it was a capsizing wave, but then they saw the outline. Long, wide, impossibly massive, sliding just below the surface. A giant, a creature so large it dwarfed the lifeboat. "A whale," Earnshaw whispered. "Dear God, it's a whale." The dark shape circled beneath them, slow and deliberate, its presence like an island moving through the deep. Some survivors panicked, others stared in awe, frozen. Spencer crouched low and whispered, "Keep still, no splashing." Whales aren't aggressive by nature, but a simple tail strike could flip the boat effortlessly. Here in the middle of nowhere, that would mean certain death. The creature rose slowly, breaking the water with a long, groaning exhale, a mist of air and warm dampness drifting across the boat. Children gasped, eyes wide. Some adults began to cry, not from fear, but from the overwhelming strangeness of the moment. The whale hovered near them, watching. A dark, ancient eye the size of a fist rose above the surface, glistening, intelligent. No one moved. Elizabeth clutched Peter and Alice close, whispering a soft prayer. For one impossible moment, it felt as if the whale understood their suffering. Then, with a gentle sweep of its enormous tail, it dipped beneath the surface and drifted away. It left behind a glassy calm and a boat full of survivors who weren't sure whether they had just been blessed or warned. The encounter rattled everyone. Even the strongest survivors were shaken. "First storms," a man muttered. "Then starvation. Now sea monsters." "It wasn't a monster," Elizabeth said quietly. "It was only curious." But even she couldn't shake the feeling that the ocean had just reminded them of their insignificance. The days stretched long and hot. Their lips cracked further. Their hands shook from dehydration. Some survivors began to hallucinate again, not from delusion, but from exhaustion, seeing shapes in the waves, hearing voices in the wind, and then came the smell. It drifted in on a faint breeze, metallic, sour, unmistakable. Something dead was nearby. At first, the survivors thought it was another lifeboat drifting toward them, but the shape floating in the water wasn't wood. It was flesh, a body, a sailor from one of the missing rafts. He was long dead, bloated and drifting. Elizabeth turned the children's heads away. Spencer silently manoeuvred the boat to avoid it, but something else was following, something dark. Several shadows. The fins appeared first, cutting through the surface in smooth, confident arcs. Grey, fast, silent sharks. A woman stifled a scream. Others gripped the oars tightly, though they had no idea what they would do with them. The sharks circled the corpse once, twice, 3 times. Then with a brutal snap, the water churned red. People turned away. Some began to sob. The ocean reminded them again. Death was close, very close. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became unbearable. The wood of the boat softened beneath the blistering rays. Ropes creaked, water sloshed. The sharks remained. At noon, one of them, a large bull shark, swam directly against the side of the lifeboat. The entire craft lurched violently. A man shouted, "It's going to roll us over!" Spencer steadied the group. "Don't move! Hold tight!" The shark's rough skin scraped loudly along the hull, with a sound like wet sandpaper tearing. It curved beneath them and vanished. Another survivor whispered, "Are they waiting for us?" No one answered. Late that afternoon, after hours of circling, the sharks suddenly dispersed, not fading away gradually, but rushing off as if something had frightened them. "What scared a shark?" someone asked. Earnshaw frowned. "Something bigger." A terrifying thought, but the truth was far stranger. Minutes later, a faint, rhythmic sound drifted over the waves. Thump, thump, thump. Is that engines? Engines! At first, no one believed it. Too many hallucinations, too many false hopes. But this sound was real, mechanical, growing louder. Spencer snatched the last flare, gripping it with trembling hands. Come on, come on! Out of the heat haze, a silhouette emerged. A ship. A real ship. The survivors screamed, waved their arms, shook pieces of clothing in the air. Elizabeth hugged her children close, whispering, "We're saved! We're saved!" The ship drew nearer, painted grey, with a tall mast and a weathered hull. A British vessel, an Allied freighter. Some didn't care. Anyone was better than the ocean. Spencer struck the flare. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. The survivors panicked, shouting, "Light it, please!" On the third strike, a spark, a tiny spark, then an explosion of red light, bright as fire in the fading afternoon. He held it high, arms shaking, tears streaming down his cheeks. The ship continued forward, closer, closer, and then it passed them. "No!" several shouted. "Turn back, please! We're here!" Their voices vanished into the vastness. The ship kept going. Elizabeth rose to her feet too quickly and nearly collapsed. Peter screamed, "Look, look!" At first nothing happened, then the ship's engines sputtered, slowed, stopped. The vessel began to turn, a wide arc, slow, agonising, coming back, coming toward them, and as it approached, a voice through a megaphone echoed across the water. "Lifeboat, we see you, hold fast!" Arms reached down, ropes were lowered. People cried, screamed, collapsed, prayed. Two sailors lifted Elizabeth first, her children clinging to her. She nearly fainted when her feet touched the deck. Spencer was the last out of the lifeboat, gaunt, dehydrated, barely able to stand, and as the sailors pulled him aboard, he heard one of them say, "You were drifting in one of the most remote patches of ocean on Earth. Another mile and we would have missed you." Spencer closed his eyes. For the first time in days, he let himself breathe without fear. The city of Cairo survivors, nearly dead, hallucinating, sunburned, starved, had been found, not by chance, but by a miracle. The deck of the rescue vessel felt unreal beneath the survivors' feet. For days they had lived with the steady rocking of the lifeboat, the constant threat of capsizing, the choking thirst of dehydration. Now the wood was solid, the air smelled of diesel, salt, and something even more miraculous, coffee. Some survivors fell to their knees, others clung to the railings, a few simply stood in stunned silence, unable to process that the battle with the sea was finally over. The ship's crew moved with practiced urgency, blankets, warm water bottles, bowls of thick broth handed out with gentle hands. One sailor crouched beside Elizabeth, who held Peter and Alice close, as if they might vanish again. "Easy now," he said softly. "Sip slowly." Elizabeth tried to thank him, but her voice cracked and dissolved into a sob. The sailor rested a hand on her shoulder, a gesture more stabilising than the entire ship beneath her feet. Spencer Earnshaw sat nearby, wrapped in a rough wool blanket, eyes half closed. His limbs trembled uncontrollably, not from cold, but from the shock of shifting from survival mode back into safety. "Captain," a crewman said quietly, "you look like you could sleep for a week." Spencer attempted a weak smile. "I might." But he didn't. He couldn't. The images of the last days looped behind his eyelids. The sinking ship, the shark's fin, the children crying in the night. A ship's medical officer examined each survivor in turn. Sunburn, salt sores, starvation, shock. Several had infections beginning to spread. One man's legs were so swollen, the doctor feared gangrene. The children, despite being dehydrated and exhausted, fared better than many of the adults. Youth, it seemed, was a shield. "That's the miracle," the doctor said to Elizabeth. "These two held on far better than we expected." Elizabeth stroked their hair, her eyes shining with tears. "We held on because we had to," she whispered. By the time the rescue ship reached the next convoy rendezvous point, word had already been radioed ahead. Survivors of the SS City of Cairo located and taken aboard. The response was immediate. Extraordinary. "Send details." We feared none survived, even in wartime, with thousands of ships lost and countless tragedies each week. The rescue of these particular lifeboats was astonishing. They had drifted hundreds of miles into a patch of ocean where shipping lanes almost never passed. The chance of being spotted was near zero, yet they had been seen, found, saved. When the survivors stepped onto land, some in Africa, others later in South America after transfers, they felt like newborns learning to walk. Elizabeth and the children were among the first off the ship. Greeted by Red Cross workers and colonial officials, the warmth of the soil beneath their feet made them cry. Peter knelt and pressed his palm against the ground. "It's warm," he said softly. Elizabeth hugged him tightly. Alice whispered, "Are we safe now?" Elizabeth nodded. "Yes, my love, we're safe." But safety was a strange, unfamiliar thing after so much fear. The survivors were given paper and pencils to write home. Many hands shook too much to form letters. Some dictated. A few had no addresses. Their families had been evacuated from towns or bombed out or displaced. Elizabeth wrote carefully, "We survived. The children are alive. Tell everyone, we survived." Spencer Earnshaw stared at his blank sheet for nearly an hour before he finally wrote, "I am alive, somehow. Trauma doesn't vanish when the danger is over." At the hospital, one man woke screaming in the night, convinced he heard sharks bumping the hull. Another refused to drink water unless he could see it poured directly from a sealed jug. A woman insisted the floor was rocking like a lifeboat and would fall over if she didn't brace herself. Even children suffered nightmares, sudden wakings, breaths caught in panic. The sound of waves triggered flashbacks. Doctors called it exhaustion shock. Today, we would call it PTSD. After weeks of recovery, survivors were placed on ships back to England, India, South Africa, Australia, scattered lives returning to scattered homes. Elizabeth held each child's hand as they boarded their next vessel. They looked stronger, healthier, but changed. Peter, once carefree, now watched the horizon constantly. Alice flinched whenever she heard a loud splash. "Will the sea hurt us again?" Peter asked. "No," Elizabeth said, but she squeezed his hand with more conviction than she felt. Before they parted ways, Spencer knelt beside Peter and Alice. "You two are the bravest crew I ever had," he said. Peter smiled shyly. Alice hugged him around the neck. "Will we ever see you again?" she asked. Spencer hesitated. "Perhaps. The world is smaller than it seems." Elizabeth placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He shook his head lightly. "You saved them as much as I did." Their goodbye was quiet, dignified, final. Many survivors lived full lives afterward. Some raised families, some carried scars, physical and emotional, for decades. Peter became a teacher. He told his students never to underestimate calm seas. Alice became a nurse during the next war, drawn to help those who suffered as she once had. Elizabeth remarried. She rarely spoke of the sinking except once, late in life, when a historian asked her what she remembered most. She replied, "The moment when the ship turned back for us. That was the moment I believed in miracles." Spencer returned to sea, as many sailors do, even after unimaginable trauma. He captained merchant ships across the Atlantic until the war's end. He was commended quietly by the British Admiralty for his composure in the lifeboat. After the war, he retired to a coastal village where he spent his days walking along the shoreline. He never married. He kept a small carved toy boat on his mantle, a gift from Peter and Alice before they parted ways. When he died in the 1960s, the toy was still there. For decades, the sinking was largely forgotten, overshadowed by the massive tragedies of World War II. Then in 2011, deep-sea exploration teams discovered the wreck at a depth of nearly 17,000 feet. The ship's bow, the cargo holds, remnants of lifeboat davits, all preserved in the crushing darkness. A memorial plaque was lowered into the water, in memory of all who sailed aboard the SS City of Cairo. Against all odds, some survived. Their courage endures. The survival of the City of Cairo lifeboat remains one of the most extraordinary open ocean rescues in history. Weeks at sea, no food or water, storms, sharks, a whale, pure chance or something more. Elizabeth once wrote in a letter to her daughter, "We lived because we would not stop hoping, and the sea, brutal as it was, let us pass." The sea is a hard storyteller. It erases more than it leaves behind. But every now and then, a fragment floats back to the surface, a memory, a name, a miracle worth rediscovering. The survivors of the City of Cairo didn't consider themselves heroes. Most refused to talk about what happened. Some carried the trauma for decades. But the fact remains, they survived something no one was meant to survive. Their endurance, their courage, their refusal to surrender to the vast, merciless ocean, that is their legacy. If this story moved you, share it, let it be known. And join me as we uncover more hidden chapters of history, moments where ordinary people did the impossible. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and stay brave.